But he has a wonderful series of books that are over there, and the one that appealed to me the most was Tice's story, because my family was part of the underground, well, their house was part of the Underground Railway in New Hampshire. Wow. And people like Frederick Douglass and Harriet Tubman went through. There were a lot of abolitionists, and I believe Owen, the Bates guy, Orrin Cheney. He came from Peterborough, where this house was, and so my interest has always been there, passed down through the years, and I'm eager to hear this story. So without further ado,
one of the first things I learned when I became editor at the Lewis and Son about 50 years ago, there was a fire call in Danville, and Ed McDonald, one of my old-time reporters, turned and he said, "We'll never see those firemen again." Because the story was, if you went into Danville, and you'd never get up. So, my hope is for you all that you have GPS in your cars. I have GPS in our car, and I had to use it to get here. How about you? Yes, okay. It's a true story. Tice stood at the banks of the swiftly flying Ohio River, contemplating his future, or the end of it. The man would come crashing through the thicket, closing in on him. Try to swim the river, he'd drown. Stay here, he'd get whipped half to death, or maybe all the way to death. That's what happened with runaway slaves. In 1860, they took a census of the United States. They found out that there were 31.4 million Americans. 31.4 million Americans. Of that number, 3.9 million, more than that, over 3.9 million people were slaves. 1860. 1 out of 8 people in the entire country was a slave. And if you look at this map here, the darker, well, fuzzy, but the darker areas show where there are more slaves than others. But 1 out of 3 Southern families owned at least one slave. 1 out of 3. And on the average plantation, now the average plantation would have 20 slaves on it. Those 20 slaves, thank you, those 20 slaves, in value, they were more valuable than all of the implements and all of the land on that plantation. That was the value of the slaves. So you see, we can go from what's one point of the rift of slavery being caused by the value of those slaves to cause one of the greatest tumultuous eras in the United States. And the state of Maine played a part in helping those slaves escape. From Kittery Point to the county and all the way in between, we helped slaves escape. There were 140,000 slaves that escaped between 1800 and 1865. 40,000 of those slaves escaped between 1860 and 1865. To get a picture of how dangerous this was, we have to put ourselves in that period of 1860, 1865. Before that time, if there was an argument, it was decided by parents. After that period, argument was decided by guns. Now, in her book, The Field of Blood, Joan Freeman wrote that Congress itself was rife with conflict. The legislative sessions were routinely punctuated by mortal threats, canings, flipped desks, all-out slugfests. Congressmen drew pistols and waved bowie knives at one another. Many were bullied in an attempt to intimidate them into compliance or silence, particularly on the issue of slavery. One legislative session, I'm quoting here, one legislative chamber erupted with a massive fist-throwing, spittoon-tossing battle royal. By 1860, armed congressmen, can you see this happening today? 1860, armed congressmen would show up Jonathan Silly, who was a United States congressman from Maine, he was killed in a duel for an alleged slight of a Whig member, somebody from the other party, and he was killed from Maine. This was a time when, if you heard of this, it's the Old South Church in Bath, Maine. Burned to the ground. Why? Because Catholics were meeting in it. You may have heard that in Lewiston, in the old, the city of downtown, they burned a church down that was being rented by the Catholics. 500 or 600 people stood across the street, and when the fire department got there, they had found out that the water lines had been cut. Those 500 to 600 people applauded, cheered as that place burned down. Wow. Lewiston, Maine, across the river. Charles Cone. When the United Methodist minister Charles Cone from New Hampshire came to Maine to start to speak for the Central Congregational Church to recruit members for the American Anti-Slavery Society, here's the quote from the newspaper. And we can trust the newspaper back then. Not that we can trust them now, but we can trust them back then, right? They were assailed by a mob which broke in the doors and the windows. They made it necessary for the meeting to escape for their lives. And the papers notified the community that the N folks took to hold a meeting when the men of property and standing drove them out. The men of standing and property drove out the people who wanted to start an anti-slavery society. And all the people were notified that such an assemblage would not be tolerated in the loyal city of Bath. An assemblage of anti-slavery would not be accepted in the city of Bath. That's loyal to slavery. For at that time, the religion, politics, and trade of Bath were under the control of slavery. And that November, Maine's first anti-slavery society was formed in Holloway. But it did not stop with those New Hampshireites, Penny, it did not stop with the New Hampshireites. Reverend Austin Willie was from Hollowell, and he was the editor of this anti-slavery called The Advocate of Freedom, that magazine. So he shows up in 1842 down at Damascotta Bridge, the old bridge between Damascotta and Newcastle. And he's speaking to a crowd there, and he says, slavery exacerbates relations between the North and the South. It arouses passions. It leads to lynching, mob violence, assassinations, murder, and duels in the slaveholding regions. Morality is completely corrupted by slavery, he said. So what do you think the reaction was? Mob violence. A mob crashed into the hall, beat him up, the people running for their lives. So they learned their lesson well down in Damascotta. It was a time of fracture, distrust, and yes, rebellion and violence. And when we talk about safe houses, when an escape